as I have kind of reflected and thought about covenant theology, dispensationalism, and then this so-called middle way, or the via media, as Wellum and Gentry put it, I think they have isolated the central issue in terms of the relationship of Israel to the church.
Okay, so you would start, first we need to ask this question, and that's what we're going to try to begin to answer, which is, what is the relationship to Israel and the church? So that's a big question when we talk about covenants and dispensationalism and all that. Okay,
that's right.
And that's what, I mean, those systems of belief, for those people who aren't familiar with that, I mean, these are systems that relate a lot to, how do we view the whole Scripture? How does it all tie together?
That's right.
They might answer the question in moderately or radically different ways.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's right. The terms usually continuity, discontinuity, right? Covenant between the covenants, between the testaments, between the Old Testament and the New. Whereas, so for covenant theology, church is a substitution or a fulfillment of Israel. All the prerogatives, promises, and prophecies to Old Testament Israel are translated to the church. So this is a system that's based on a system of continuity, whereas, for example, and these are issues we can get onto later, but circumcision of infants in the Old Testament, baptism of infants in the New Testament, okay?
So there'd be a strong continuity within classical covenant theology.
Right.
So what are examples, like examples of, that might be sometimes considered like classic Presbyterian covenantalism, like who would we point to give people an idea of, like, let's say they said, I want to read some guys on that. Who would you recommend, or what would be a comment you might want to add to that?
Well, probably current day Michael Horton writes about it, a theologian from yesteryear, John Murray. Who was the guy, Gordon Conwell? Meredith Klein is very interesting on that. A little bit, and within, I was talking to Dr. Meade before, within covenant theology, even classic covenant Presbyterian, there's a wider divergence than you might think. So between Klein and Murray, for example, there's a pretty substantial difference.
Okay, so that's our interjection. So you got covenant theology. You're explaining. Continue on, please.
Okay, so again, a system of continuity. Now, dispensational theology, I hope these are fair. Israel is distinct from the church. All the prophecies to Old Testament Israel mean and point forward to a national restoration of ethnic Israel in the millennium. Different purposes are for the people of God, okay? So there's a different purpose for Israel than there is for the church in dispensational thought.
So is it all right to put it this way? I'm trying to break it down as much as I can. It's almost discussing how do we view God's people. And so in one system, covenant theology, there's sort of one people of God. At one point in the Old, it was Israel in the Old Testament. At this point today, it's the church in the New Testament era, you might say, or the era of the church. In dispensational theology, there's essentially two peoples of God, correct? And so there's Israel, and it has promises that God gave to Israel, and then there's the church and different things God's going to do with the church. But the things that God intends to do with Israel won't translate to the church. There's things that still God intends to do, like giving them a kingdom and all that kind of stuff, right?
Correct. That's how I would understand it. Yeah.
So if that's true, and this is really a question for everybody then, is it fair to say that the most critical dividing line between whether you're essentially a covenant theologian, wherever on that continuum you may be, or essentially a dispensational theologian, wherever you may be, the issue of the two peoples of God is the single most central issue? Is that a fair statement?
I think so. And then other promises, such as the land promise, the political status of Israel, are, I think, subsidiary to.
But they almost follow necessarily.
That's right. I think so. Yeah. I think so.
We have a minute to define covenant. Now we can pick it up on the other side of the break, but can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what a covenant even is?
A covenant, I think, is a solemn agreement between two parties.
Okay.
As presented in Scripture. So there are numerous examples of covenants between two human beings. So Genesis 21, Abraham and Abimelech make a covenant with one another. The covenants that we're focusing on are the divine to human covenants. And so, we can talk more about that.
So the big two would just be old and new.
Old and new, yep.
But then within the old, there'd be a number we would talk about.
We would have the creation covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant.
All right, more about covenants and what that means about how we put our Bibles together with Dr. John Meade, Backpack Radio.
Welcome back to Backpack Radio. You're listening to our show on progressive covenantalism.
That's a mouthful.
What does that mean? It's an important show, guys, because a lot of our listeners, if you think about it, the issue of how is the Bible put together? What are the hooks, if you will, that we can kind of get a handle on it? And within the church, really sound people, there's been this issue. We're all debating the continuity and the discontinuity of the Bible. Everybody believes in continuity. Everybody believes in discontinuity. The question is,
degree,
how do they fit together? Yeah. So progressive covenantalism is I understand, a fairly new term, which is an approach to put together the old and the new covenant in a way that does justice to all of the teaching. And we're pleased to have with us Dr. John Meade of Phoenix Seminary, an adherent of that, an expert in it, and we're really discussing that. But for the larger radio audience, really it's the issues of, are you a dispensationalist? Are you a covenant theologian? And then within each camp, there are variations on the theme. And I think we left the last show with you kind of talking about defining covenants, plural, maybe starting with covenant. Would you go ahead and take that where you left off, please?
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, as I said in the last bit, there are multiple examples of covenants in the Old Testament. In particular, we see covenants between, say, individuals like David and Jonathan, right? When they make a covenant with each other to be loyal and engage in steadfast love with one another. We also see examples of covenants between sort of Abraham and Abimelech in Genesis 21. So almost kind of like an individual and a nation. Of course, the Bible in Proverbs 2 and Malachi 3 or 4 talks about marriage as a covenant, okay? And so there are numerous examples of human-to-human covenants in the Bible.
Dr. Meade, I'm talking to a kid. I'm trying to explain the Bible to them.
Yes.
They're 7 years old or so, and I want to try to give them a real quick working but accurate definition of covenant. I say a covenant is a very serious promise. Will that be acceptable? Will that work?
Yeah, a very serious promise for a committed relationship.
Okay.
That's right.
All right, okay. So continue on.
Yeah, and the covenants that, the 6 or so covenants in the Bible that describe God's relationship to humanity, this is where we left off. So in Genesis 1 and 2, I hold that there is a covenant with creation and with Adam as the head of creation.
Do you have a name you like to give that? Because I know there's even sometimes debate about what you name that.
Yeah, so I don't call it a covenant of works, as covenant theology might refer to it as, but I do call it a covenant with creation.
Okay.
Because it's with more than just Adam.
Okay.
So this covenant is then renewed or upheld, I think is the better language, in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 with Noah.
Okay.
So Adam is the head of humanity. There's a covenant made with him. And Noah is portrayed as a new Adam.
Right, yeah, you see the creation language there again in Genesis 6, especially when they leave the ark. You see creation language, and you see creation referred to, and even it seems a new relationship between man and the creatures that God has put him around.
That's right. Okay. That's right. Yep. So there's a little bit of progress in a sense, but essentially I think it's the same covenant upheld. We get this from Genesis 6:18. The Lord comes to Noah and says, "I'm going to uphold my covenant with you." He's speaking of a definite covenant that is already in existence. And so this is sort of the playing field by which God will relate to all of humanity.
Another quick question. You said there's a little bit of progress there from Adam to Noah. Is that a specific word choice? And what, if it was, what did you mean by that? Because that could be progressive covenantalism?
Well, yes, this relates to progressive covenantalism,
okay.
Of course. And as the story, the grand story of the Bible progresses, we see that God narrows in from all of humanity down to one and his family, and that's Abraham.
Okay.
So in Genesis 12, we get the calling of Abraham. Genesis 15, moving very quickly here, Genesis 15 is the covenant that is cut or initiated with Abraham. Genesis 17 is not a separate covenant, as some covenant theologians hold. Genesis 17 is not the covenant of circumcision. It is simply the upholding of the covenant made in Genesis 15.
Would it be appropriate to call it a reaffirmation, or?
Yeah, it's just God standing by His word. So He's upholding His previous word.
So is this a bad or good analogy? A couple renews their wedding vows.
I love the analogy.
All right, we're tracking.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I bet you check with them before the show.
No, I didn't. I was. This is a true story. I was chilling at Chick-fil-A with my friend Daniel here, and I get a call, and it's in the middle of our Bible study, so I have to say, Lord, should I answer this? And I see it's from Kentucky. And just like my friend Daniel said, what business have I to do with those in Kentucky? But I picked it up just to see, and believe it or not, it was Dr. Meade. So I'm glad I did. And that was the extent of our conversation. But okay, right. Continue on.
Yeah. So Genesis 12 would be like an engagement. Genesis 15, the marriage ceremony. Right. Genesis 17, the reaffirmation. Moving on, the covenant is with Abraham and his seed, his descendants, who become the nation of Israel. And so the covenant that God makes with Israel at Sinai is also an affirmation of God's promise and covenant made with Abraham, now made with his family as the nation promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Skipping a lot of details. The nation fails in multiple ways. The covenant, the promises that God is making and the kingdom that He is building through these covenants, He now will do through the monarchy of Israel and the covenant that He makes with David. And this covenant can be seen in 2 Samuel 7. It's quite clear that this covenant is going to subsume and fulfill the covenant made with Abraham.
So is that the idea of kingdom through covenant?
Yes.
Because you said he'll do it through the monarchy?
That's right. And the kingdom theme, of course, is nascent or before David, but now it is made explicit in Israel's monarchy. Yeah.
Follow-up questions on this, guys, before we close out this segment. I thought that was a good beginning, to this idea.
So really what this is doing is helping people as they read through the Old Testament, seeing how sort of God's relationship with people is unfolding, and different promises and obligations that come along with it. And really what we want people to do is track along with that, because the big question is then how does that change, or does it change as we move into the New Testament?
Yes, very good. The only thing I would qualify is that these covenants it's so fascinating. God is showing us how to relate to one another.
Yeah, that's a good point.
These are faithful, loyal relationships, loving relationships.
So, Dr. Meade, help our listeners from a dispensational background. Why is the structure that you just gave, going through those 5 covenants, superior, if you would use that word, to a more of a dispensational approach to the structure of the Bible?
Yes, so a lot of the supporting exegesis has been left out here. I think that really the key comes down to, what is God promising to Abraham at the very beginning? Is He promising an exclusive nation who will kind of head and lead all the others? Or do we really believe that Abraham is going to be the father of many nations?
Okay.
And all?
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, more to discuss. We're going to get into on the next segment. I think you want to stick around for this, and we're even going to play some Shy Lynn when we come back from the break, talking Dr. John Meade, Kingdom Through Covenant, and all of that. Backpack Radio.
Welcome back to Backpack Radio. Good to have you we're in the studio, but good to have you all listening to us. We are talking about progressive covenantalism with Dr. John Meade from Phoenix Seminary. And really, you might say, to break it down for you all, it's a show about how we put our Bibles together. How do we understand the Old and New Testament and the relationship between the two? The two dominant ways of looking at it are covenant theology and dispensationalism. And we're talking about, you might say, a way to bring out maybe a middle way, as I think the authors of the book Kingdom Through Covenant put it. Dr. Meade, really, you're at the point with us sort of understanding now how we understand the New Covenant in the major Old Testament prophecies.
That's right. Okay. Yeah, so let's continue on that theme. The New Covenant is, I think, most clearly seen in Jeremiah 31. It is forecasted here that there will be a new covenant made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and it's not going to be like the one that God made with Israel when He took him out of Egypt. This covenant will be made with the house of Israel. Interesting, He doesn't repeat house of Israel and house of Judah. He's envisioning a new people of God here, with the house of Israel only. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. The new covenant community is a regenerate community with the law of God written on their hearts, and it is a forgiven community, a community who has their sins forgiven. This is Jeremiah. The way this is picked up in Isaiah 54, verse 13, the new covenant people of God are those who are taught by the Lord. They are taught by God. That is, there is no intermediary teaching them directly, but God, by the Spirit, teaches their hearts, so to speak, so that they will follow God and obey his ways. Last one, Ezekiel 36. The way the new covenant is picked up in Ezekiel, it's called a covenant of peace. It ensures a heart transplant. The heart of stone, the heart of rebelliousness and stubbornness is taken out, and it is replaced with a heart of flesh, a heart that is submissive to God. This heart transplant takes place so that the people of God will obey God and his ways and his commandments.
Is this jumping ahead too far? But is there a connection in John 6 when Jesus says that I will raise him up on the last day? This is verse 44. 45 says, It is written in the prophets, and they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. What is Jesus saying there in relation to that? Is he basically saying, I'm fulfilling it? What else is he saying there, Dr.
Yeah,
Meade?
I think so. And verse 44, of course, is very important there, right? No one comes to the Father no one comes to me except who the Father draws, right? So we're talking about the supernatural working of God on the heart of man to come. And yes, Jesus, I think, appeals to Isaiah 54:13, the taught by God language, to show that this was what was going to happen. Paul says the same exact thing in 1 Thessalonians 4:7. You have no need for anyone to write to you to remind you to love one another, for you have all been taught by God.
Right.
Paul is addressing the Thessalonian church
as a new covenant community.
As the new covenant community of God. That's
wow.
Right.
So this, you guys can see why it's important. Now, to be fair, we're not saying that, some of these big things are some things that there's broad agreement upon. Now, there's definitely differences and disagreement. But my point is, no matter where you fall on this, what we've just been saying is important for every Christian to understand and agree to a large extent, right? That's kind of like the big item.
That's right. That's right.
What kind of questions do you want to pepper him with? We only have a minute, but give our listeners a taste of the kind of things you're going to throw his way in relation to what we've discussed so far.
Well, we want to maybe try to anticipate what people might say in objection to this. And certainly one of the things I've come across is people saying, well, we need to take seriously the promises that God makes to ethnic Israel in the Old Testament. These seem very specific, related to land and other things, that you're sort of flattening the text by saying that it all sort of gets subsumed into the church.
So we'll give you the break to think about that question, and then that's from the dispensational side.
So what should we expect from the rest of our human history?
What's up? This is Backpack Radio. That's off the new Christ-centric album called The Jude Injunction, and that song's called Thy Kingdom Come. Post-millennialism.
They're post-millennials?
Yeah. So we haven't really talked about the end eschatology. We're talking eschatology in a certain sense throughout the show, but we haven't talked about the kind of that eschatology or how it relates. Well, but the thing is, it does all relate because this song is even called Thy Kingdom Come. And so we're discussing progressive covenantalism, which is more kingdom through covenant. There's some differences there. So that's why I played the Shylin Mill perspective song, and now I'm playing this. So we're just... I'm trying to relate the rap songs to the show's content in a roundabout way. You know what I'm saying? What's a question you would want to ask from the Dr. Peter Gentry chain?
Well, we'll pick it up from the end of the last segment. I won't recap it in length, but basically that this view doesn't take seriously enough the Old Testament promises to Israel. Right. How would we begin to answer that?
Yeah, great. One of the hermeneutics involved here is a hermeneutic of sitting at the feet of Jesus and the apostles in order to understand the Old Testament. So I just want to start, I think particularly the land promise. This seems to be the crux, okay? And so when I read Paul in Romans 4:13, for the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world, the cosmos, did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. I'm left immediately to understand, in the Old Testament, it's not explicitly stated that way, that Abraham would and his family would be heirs of the whole world.
So there's some interpretation going on there.
Yeah. So I did a little work on this one time, and I went back and I started to look at all the different texts which outline the boundaries and even the inhabitants of the land originally. And it's very interesting. There's a ton of fluidity and a ton of variation. Sometimes there's 6 peoples. Sometimes there's 7 peoples. Sometimes there's 10 original inhabitants of the land of Canaan.
Hold on. When you say peoples...
Like Hittites, Jebusites, yeah.
So different ites.
Yeah, different ites. Okay. Yeah, good way to put it. So sometimes 6, sometimes 7, sometimes 10. The land boundaries themselves in the 4 or 5 major texts which outline the boundaries don't actually agree.
You're saying they name different peoples, so they're not exhaustive.
They name different peoples. The boundaries don't seem to be actually set. Okay.
So there's fluidity there too,
in the
how
boundaries.
Far the land extends.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a little bit more of a theology as opposed to like a rigid geography, if I can put it that way. The other point is, again, Abraham, when his name is changed from Abram to Abraham, he's to become the father of many nations, not particularly one. So even when I'm looking at the Old Testament texts, I start to kind of think that Paul's putting all the data together. And he comes up with Abraham is to be an heir of the whole world, not necessarily an heir of a particular piece of real estate in Palestine today. The last text I would go to in Genesis 20.
Can I stop?
Yes.
How has Abraham become heir of the whole world, though? So, I mean, I agree, but then what would that mean?
Yeah. So how does Abram become the heir of the whole world? Well, it's through this next text. In Genesis 22, the heir of Abraham is to overtake the gates of his enemies, showing that even the land boundaries established are to be expanded. Okay. The question is through the heir, which Paul, I think, answers in Galatians 3.
All right.
Galatians 3.
We're turning to Galatians 3.
Verse 15.
If you're in your
16.
car, don't do this.
Yeah, don't do this.
If you're in Starbucks, go ahead and do it.
Galatians 3:15 or 16.
Here we go.
Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring. And then Paul interprets, who is Christ. You see, the entire Abrahamic covenant, the entire Abrahamic promise made to him and to his seed or his descendants, his offspring, is now boiled down to one faithful Israelite, who is Jesus Christ. You see?
So that's where N.T. writes, maybe popularize it. Jesus is the new Israel stuff.
That's exactly right. And this is progressive covenantalism's, I think, contribution to the discussion. It doesn't work simply from Israel to church.
Okay.
It goes from Israel to Christ, and it's sort of an hourglass, if you can picture that. Everything focuses in on the one, Jesus Christ. And then if you read the end of Galatians 3, the last verse, the last verse, and if you are Christ's, and he's already laid out you are Christ by faith.
Okay.
If you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, plural now, heirs according to promise. And so from there, the hourglass expands out, you see. So the Abrahamic covenant is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And now by those who are of faith, the faith of Abraham, you see, that's how the promises are fulfilled, I think. So you asked how, in what way? Christ is the mechanism. Now, how is the land promise fulfilled? Is that kind of...
sounds good.
Yeah,
well, I can go there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the inhabitants of the world, all those who are truly Abraham's descendants, you see, who are heirs of Abraham, are now actually fulfilling the land promise, even now, I think, in some way, by occupying the globe, but ultimately in a newer way, in a consummated way, when we get to the new heavens and the new earth.
So 2 quick follow-ups.
Yes.
Would you say then a key to this view would be allowing the New Testament hermeneutic of interpretation govern the meaning of the Old Testament?
There you go.
Very true.
Is that and that's one of the debated points, I suppose.
Oh, yeah.
And then 2 is just reading again from this review that Darrell Bach, professor at Dallas, and I take him as a thoughtful response of many dispensationalists. He comes back and says the failure of progressive dispensationalism to take seriously Romans 9 through 11.
Failure of progressive covenantalism.
Yeah, progressive covenantalism.
Yeah, progressive.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that correction.
Yeah.
Could you? And you're familiar, I think, with his comment as well as most dispensations. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I my only comment on that is, I think there's been a number of folks who would align with progressive covenantalism who have dealt with Romans 9 through 11. If you look at Tom Schreiner's commentary on Romans, that would be a view that would be, I think, consonant with progressive covenantalism.
So that's an example of the exegesis you would see that would be consistent with
Correct.
What series is that in? Is that the blue and white pillar ones? Or is
no,
that
it's the Baker exegetical, the purple bindings. Yeah,
because that's the Moo one. Sorry.
So I think either view, if you take Romans 11:26, once the hardening of the Jews is over and the full number of the Gentiles has come in, thus all Israel will be saved. You could understand that as Israel is both Jews and Gentiles together. Or even Tom Schreiner's view, where you have a final remnant of Israel that is saved in the end. But I would come back to Professor Bach and just ask, where is Romans 9 to 11 promising a geopolitical nation to Israel? You see, I see a lot of talk of remnant and a lot of talk of coming to faith. Now, even if that is consonant with the original Abrahamic promise, so in other words, it's not like the tree has been cut down completely, right, in Romans 11. But either way, Paul is viewing the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant as ethnic Jews coming to faith in Jesus Christ, not in a geopolitical sense, in Romans 9 to 11.
Do you think that's a good follow-up question? Because you and I have talked about some of this before. To me, that's a good question to ask about that text. I mean, what are your thoughts about what he's saying in relation to some of the criticism he might get from a progressive dispensationalist?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely helpful, and I appreciate if anything, the notion of or the importance of seeing what the verses say and really taking seriously. I mean, sort of what some of these verses say, which suggest, well, not to suggest, I think they really show that. If anything, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's almost like the promises that we see in the Old Testament, they expand. You know, it's almost like we.
They're I think bigger than rivers and mountains.
Exactly.
And trees,
and I think that's the failure of the dispensational view is they're sort of focused on, God's intention is to give the whole earth, really, to his people.
That's right.
And the question, obviously, is then how you define people and all those things.
So it's not a replacement, it's an expansion is maybe a better way to talk about it?
Yeah, I like fulfillment.
Okay. To fill up the full meaning?
Yeah, well, right.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
And then, and I love the focus on Christ. I mean, I never really thought about that way. So an hourglass. I think that's a very helpful grid, a way of imaging in your mind what this view is trying to say.
I do like that too. Yeah. So again, just to repeat, if somebody asks you the question from a progressive covenantal point of view, is there a future for ethnic Israel? The answer is
not in a geopolitical sense. No.
Okay, there could be Schreiner, and then even John Murray argues for that in his commentary on Romans.
Yeah, because Romans 11 is
more of a classic covenantal guy.
Yeah,
that there could be a mass saving of Jews.
That's right.
Yeah,
of future ethnic Jews.
So that isn't distinct to progressive covenantalism.
No.
So well, maybe what are some? That's a theological implication. Relation to the land. Any other specific theological implications you want to bring out? You only have a short time to do it, but if you would like to,
a few. One, I let's not get too far away from the concept of covenant.
Mm-hmm.
I love when I teach this in the classroom. I love to talk about how our culture has largely forgotten the concept of covenant.
Yeah.
And yet this is the primary way in which God relates to humanity and to his people. And it is also the way I think we are to relate to one another with concepts like loyalty and faithfulness and speaking the truth in love.
It's really good.
Yeah, these kinds of things. So let's not lose sight of that theological implication before we get into the big ones.
Right.
Others, the importance of kingdom through covenant for doctrine of the church. I don't know if you want to go here, but I'm a Baptist. I did go to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, but I do think the focus on the new covenant leads us to a believer's church or a regenerate church membership. Those who are a part of the new covenant have their sins forgiven, you see. And so I think that's a major implication for what they're saying.
And so that would be
believer's baptism.
This show was mainly a difference between progressive covenantalism and classic dispensationalism, but that would maybe lead us into some of the differences between some forms of classic covenantalism and this.
That's right. Correct.
And that would be a good topic for us to discuss on the show, because we have different views on that, and that's a good discussion as well, I think.
It's good.
It would be.
Tell us briefly,
Good
20
stuff.
seconds, what you got going on. Maybe about the blog, some future writing. What's going on?
Well, I'm excited. Actually, just on the same thread here, Progressive Covenantalism there will be a spin-off volume. There'll be a multi-contributor volume. I'm writing an article in that on a biblical theology of circumcision. Tom Schreiner on the Sabbath. Ardell Canaday.
We'll have to look for that. We'll put a link up on the show.
Future shows.
Yes. Let's do a personal question. Tell us a little bit about your time at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and the homie, Dr. Peter Gentry, because you used to hang out with him a lot. Tell us little stories.
Oh, man. These were some of the sweetest years of my life. I spent about 10 years in Louisville working with on my MDiv and my PhD, taking classes from both Peter Gentry and Stephen Wellum.
Yeah.
And both are good friends of mine. Dr. Peter Gentry is a dear friend. Just texted him this morning, actually, and about the radio show, and he said he was going to be praying for me as I'm on here, and so very good friend. We've kept in touch. A hard master in some ways,
Dude,
good.
Ramon, when he just said that, what did you just think?
Well, of course, Snake Eyes.
Yeah.
We just totally thought about G.I. Joe.
Right.
When you said that.
But
the hard master.
That's right. But what I mean is
I have no idea what you're talking about.
one who pushed me, and held my feet to the fire in the best way possible.
You know what you just said is so funny, because on Twitter, there's a Twitter feed called twitter.com, not Dr. Gentry.
Yes.
And it says not Peter Gentry. And on it says, as the description, linguistic Jedi and Bible ninja. I make students have their nightmares in Hebrew. Not official Peter Gentry Twitter. I've been following that Peter Gentry Twitter for a while. It's so funny. Like, let me read the last one from February 3rd. To me, this is hilarious. SBTS is closed today. I'm never closed. New Greek car, make Oikia. Man of the automobile house, newspaper reports. It's just so funny.
So man, he has quite a reputation then. Wow.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and then there's one that says my third grade portrait, and it's like his body, his old man head imposed upon a cartoon animal body, like Animal from the Muppets. It looks like it's just, but it's like he still has the same face with glasses, but he's in third grade. It's just okay. Well, hopefully he doesn't listen to the show actually, because he'll say, brother, you did all right, but why did you ever acquiesce to going on a show with those idiots? Except for Pastor Bob. He seems more respectable. Maybe if we could just, right?
Let him lead the show? Okay.
Okay. So, Ramon, handing it over to you.